Father, I thank you. You are a good God, and you are a God who loves us, and we love you. And we are here tonight to learn from you. We are here tonight to perform an act of worship that is studying your word. So I ask that what you would like to have brought forth gets brought forth tonight. That we will see truth in your word, and that we will understand what you did and what you are doing, and a little bit better of who you are. In the name of Yeshua HaMashiach, amen and amen. Acts chapter 2. Aren't we excited? We finally got there.
Yay! Pentecost is here.
Pentecost is here almost, yes. And we're going to read through the first 15 verses, because that's about how far we're going to get tonight. First 15 verses. And but hey, that's almost half the chapter. Well, it's a third of the chapter, so.
The first verse has the entrance of Pentecost.
Yes. You want to read those verses for us, Moshe?
Sure.
Would you mind?
1 through 15?
1 through 15.
Okay. The festival of Shavuot arrived, and the believers all gathered together in one place. Suddenly there came a sound from the sky like the roar of a violent wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Then they saw what looked like tongues of fire, which separated and came to rest on each one of them. They were all filled with the Ruach HaKodesh and began to talk in different languages as the Spirit enabled them to speak. Now there were staying in Jerusalem religious Jews from every nation under the heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd gathered, and they were confused because each one heard the believer speaking in his own language. Totally amazed, they asked, "How is this possible? Aren't these guys a bunch of dummies? I mean, aren't these guys speaking from Galilee?"
Yep. That's what they meant.
That's what they meant. How is it that we hear from them speaking our native languages? We are Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Yehuda, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, Jews by birth and proselytes, Jews from Crete and from Arabia. How is it that we hear them speaking in our own languages about the great things that God has done? Amazed and confused, they all went on asking each other, "What does this mean?" But others made fun of them, saying, "They've had too much wine." Then Kepha stood up with the 11 and raised his voice to address them and said, "Hey, we're not drunk."
Yeah, basically.
You Judeans and all of you staying here in Jerusalem, let me tell you what this means. Listen carefully to me. These people aren't drunk as you suppose. It's only 9 in the morning. Okay, that's where you said to stop. So.
It's only 9 in the morning.
We're not drunk.
We're not drunk. And there's some things in this translation that are a little different than what some of the study materials I read out of. So I'll address that when we get there. But the first things first is it's Shavuot. And in most Bibles, most Christian Bibles, it says Pentecost, right? And one of the things that's happened several times to me is I've been talking to different people, and they don't understand Pentecost. In their book, Pentecost is the Christian holiday. Shavuot's a Jewish holiday, right? And in fact, I'm going to read something. This is right out of, what's the name of the site? It should have given it to me. Oh well, this is one of the Jewish websites that gives definitions of things, and it's from an Aish type organization. It's aish.com.
Oh, yeah, I like this stuff.
Okay,
Yeah.
Aish. And this is something that says, Shavuot, the Festival of Weeks, is the second of 3 major festivals with historical and agricultural significance. The other 2 are Passover and Sukkot. Agriculturally, it commemorates the time when the first fruits were harvested and brought to the temple, and it is known as Hag HaBikurim, or the Festival of the First Fruits. Historically, it celebrates the giving of Torah at Mount Sinai, and is also known as Hag Matan Toratenu, or the Festival of the Giving of the Torah. Now then it goes on and it says a few other things, but I love this. The period from Passover to Shavuot is a time of great anticipation. We count each of the days from the second day of Passover to the day before Shavuot, 49 days or 7 weeks. Hence the festival. Hence the name of the festival. See the counting of the Omer. Okay, so that's another link you could go to. The counting reminds us the important connection between Passover and Shavuot. Then it says Shavuot is also known as Pentecost because it falls on the 50th day. However, Shavuot has no particular similarity to the Christian holiday of Pentecost, which occurs 50 days after after their spring holiday. Now, I will tell you something. They've not read the material that I've read. If they don't think there's any connections, they have not read the second chapter of Acts. It's as simple as that.
No.
They haven't read it. Because there are many, many, many connections to Shavuot and what happens in the second chapter of Acts. But Pentecost is Shavuot. It is not a Christian holiday. It's the same holiday. It's not something that was come up with later. The church didn't invent it. I know one person who one of the reasons she came to me to ask questions at one point was because she'd seen a movie, and in this movie, it had Caesar saying something about Pentecost, and she wanted to know, how did he know about Pentecost before it happened? And I said, because Pentecost is not a Christian holiday, it's a Jewish holiday that's been going on for a long time. A long time. In fact, it had been going on by this point in time 1,300 years. Okay.
So you're going to explain to me or us
The connection.
the connection,
Absolutely.
because
That's what tonight's going to be all about, is the connection.
So
All
I read
about
that
the
too. I read
connections.
about the two different things, but I always thought it was the same thing.
It is the same holiday.
Yeah.
It is the same holiday. Shavuot simply is the Hebrew name. Pentecost became the Greek name. Penta means 50. Pentecost means counted days. So there's 50
Counting the
counted
Omer.
days.
Yep.
Period. That's what it means.
Basically, counting of the Omer.
Counting of the
days,
Omer. Yeah.
what does Omer mean?
Omer is a handful. It's a measurement.
Yeah.
So it's a fist or a grabbed handful of grain from the barley harvest. And that's what an omer is. It's a handful. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Sorry.
That's okay. Because those are all questions that we're all going to have. And when you have a question, please ask. That way we can make sure we understand it. The events that happen, as described here in the second chapter of Acts, the ones we just read about, are all parts of the celebration of a festival of the giving of the Torah. Okay? Shavuot is a celebration of the giving of Torah, when Torah was given on Mount Sinai. So let's look at the scriptural background of Shavuot that they're celebrating, because that's why they're in Jerusalem. That's why everybody's there, is because it is Shavuot. So Deuteronomy 16:9 through 12,
I have that.
and then verse 16. And I got a lot of this stuff marked, so I have to figure out which one is it. Okay, there it is.
It says, count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count 7 weeks with the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain. And you shall perform the festival of Shavuot to, oh my God, mine says Yahweh. But
Are you
I
on
think we should say
16?
that.
Are you in Deuteronomy 16:9 through 12?
Oh, I'm looking at 9, 16.
Chapter
Starting at
16.
9, yeah. Chapter 16, Deuteronomy.
Verse 9.
It starts with you already count. Okay, yeah, sorry.
Count 7 weeks, okay.
Go
The
ahead.
sickle to the grain, and you shall perform the festival of Shavuot to, I guess I'll say Adonai,
Yeah.
your Elohim, according to the voluntary offering from your hand, which you give as Adonai, your Elohim, blessings to you. And you shall rejoice before Adonai, your Elohim, you and your son and your daughter and your male servant and your female servant, and the Levite who is within your gates, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow who are in your midst, at the place where Adonai your Elohim chooses to make his name dwell. And you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and you shall guard and do these laws.
And verse 16.
3 times a year, all your males appear before Adonai your Elohim in the place which he chooses, at the festival of Mazat, and at the festival of Shavuot, and the festival of Sukkot. And none should appear before Adonai empty-handed.
Okay, so 3 times a year, all men of Israel are to go to the place God assigns, which he will assign in the future. It wasn't assigned here yet, but he chooses Jerusalem, Yerushalayim. And they are to go to celebrate these 3 festivals. They have to be there for the festival of matzah, or unleavened bread, otherwise known as Passover. Because Passover is the first day. Then there's the week of unleavened bread. Okay, so they're supposed to be in Jerusalem for Passover, Pesach. Then they also have to be there for Shavuot. A lot of times if they traveled a long ways, they literally just stayed the whole time because travel was not easy sometimes. And then the third one is in the fall, Sukkot. So we've got a spring festival they're all required to come to, a summer festival they're all required to come to, and a fall festival. And notice it says men. There's a reason for that. It's not good for a pregnant woman to travel. So women who wanted to go could go. But because we have been given the special role of caring for the family, we're not bound by time-specific mitzvah in Torah. That means as women, we are not bound to do the things in the exact same way that the men are bound to do them, because we're expected to take care of the needs of the family. And, you know, if a baby is crying because they're hungry, you can't say, I need to put on my Teflon right now. Sorry, you feed the baby. It is a lot of travel, and that's why it says in the book of Acts where it says religious Jews, because those who weren't particularly religious didn't do it, because it wasn't easy. And those who lived really far away, it's kind of like the Muslims in their trip to Mecca. You have to do it a couple times in your life, but every year is just not necessarily possible. So they would appoint someone as a representative of their family. So someone who represented their family would go every year, but it might be a different person. That's an accommodation that was made by rabbinical understanding by Ezra and his group, so that they could make that accommodation. Because you're right, not everybody could do it. It was expensive. It was time-consuming. It takes the breadwinner away from his job to provide for the family. So that's why it was the religious Jews. Leviticus 23, 9 through 21.
I knew you were going to say that. Adonai said to Moshe, tell the people of Israel, after you enter the land I am giving you and harvest its ripe crops, you are to bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the Kohen. He is to wave the sheaf before Adonai so that you will be accepted. The Kohen is to wave it on the day after the Shabbat. On the day that you are to wave the sheaf, you are to offer a male lamb without defect in its first year as a burnt offering for Adonai. His grain offering is to be 1 gallon of fine flour mixed with olive oil, and an offering made by fire to Adonai is a fragrant aroma. Its drink offering is to be of wine, 1 quart. You are not to eat bread, dried grain, or fresh grain until the day you bring the offering for your God. This is a permanent regulation throughout all your generations, no matter where you live. From the day after the day of rest, that is, from the day you bring the sheaf for waving, you are to count 7 full weeks. Till the day after the 7th week, you are to count 50 days. And then you are to present a new grain offering to Adonai. You must bring bread from your homes for waving, 2 loaves made with 1 gallon of fine flour baked with leaven, as first fruits for Adonai. Along with the bread, present 7 lambs without defect, 1 year old, 1 young bull, and 2 rams. These are to be a burnt offering for Adonai with their grain and drink offerings. An offering made by fire as a fragrant aroma for Adonai. Offer 1 male goat as a sin offering and 2 male lambs 1 year as a sacrifice of peace offerings. The Kohen will wave them with the bread of the first fruits of a wave offering before Adonai with the 2 lambs. These will be holy for Adonai for the Kohen. On the same day you are to call a holy convocation. Do not do any kind of ordinary work. This is a permanent regulation throughout all your generations, no matter where you live.
That makes it kind of clear, doesn't it? As to when it starts, when you start the count and all that stuff. Well, probably not as clear as we think.
Okay, just a couple arguments on that area.
There's a couple arguments. We're going to talk about that. Exodus 23, 14 through 17.
Exodus what? What is it?
Someone have Exodus 23, 14 through 17?
I have 19.
Oh, 23?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Come on,
Pay attention,
Matcha.
Shirley.
That would be me.
Come
That's
on.
okay.
Come on,
23.
Matcha.
All right. 14 through 17. Okay.
It's a feast of matzah, so.
3 times a year you are to observe a festival for me. Keep the festival of matzah for 7 days as I have ordered you, and you are to eat matzah at the time determined in the month of Aviv. For it was in that month that you left Egypt. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. Next, the festival of harvest, the first fruits of your efforts sowing in the field, and last, the festival of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in from the fields the results of your efforts. 3 times a year, all men are to appear before the Lord Adonai.
Okay, so 3 times a year, all the men are supposed to come. They're supposed to come with offerings and sacrifices. And it's mentioned in each of these that it's a harvest, right? So it's a harvest festival. It's about the gathering in of the harvest, first fruits. All the men are supposed to be there, but where does it say that it's about the giving of the Torah? Do you see that anywhere in this? We see all this description of the sacrifices. We see this description of these things, but in the giving of the word, in the writing of the commandments regarding this, it doesn't tell us that Shavuot is the giving of Torah. Now, I will tell you I believe it is, and I'll tell you why. But there are many, and I have heard them, and it irritates me to no end, who will take and look at this and go, oh, black and white. Obviously, it's not the giving of Torah, because it would have said so right here.
And
So,
obviously it led up to the giving of the Torah because it was the final and the great day, which I'm sorry.
but yeah, we'll get there.
Yeah.
Because there is a place in Scripture where it does tell us the day Torah is given. And it coincides with the day of Shavuot. Scripturally, it does. But people, unless you read all of it and you put it all together, you don't get that part. This explains why everybody was in Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem was crowded. It explains why people from all those different languages are there. People from all those different countries. But doesn't give us a date, except by inference. You have to do the math to come up with the actual date. We have the date for Passover. It tells us on Nisan 14th, on the 14th day of this month. This is the month that begins your year. And on the 14th day of this month, you do this. And we have the date for the blowing of the trumpets. It tells us on the first day of this month. And we have the date for unleavened bread, which is actually a whole week. It gives us the specific dates. It gives us specific dates for Yom Kippur and a specific date for Sukkot. But it doesn't give us a specific date here. It makes us do the math.
Yep.
It literally makes us do the math. Okay. So first it says nothing about the giving of the Torah, and it says nothing about giving of a date. And since the first is going to be last, I'm going to talk about the last first. Okay? I'm going to talk about the date before we go into why we know it's the Torah. Leviticus 23:15. We're back at Leviticus 23. So it says, from the day after the day of rest. Now my other Bible, it says from the day after the Sabbath. That is from the day you bring the sheaf for waving, you are to count 7 full weeks. So the day after the Sabbath, in verse 11, he's to wave a sheaf before Adonai so that it will be accepted. The Kohen is to wave it on the day after the Shabbat, or after the Sabbath, okay? So the question is, what is the Sabbath that it's talking about? And the reason that's a question is because Passover, they have the day that they actually slaughter the lambs, and then they have to eat them overnight, and the next day is a convocation day. It is a day of rest. It is a Sabbath. So Nisan 14th is the day you sacrifice. The 15th is a day of rest.
Yep.
That is a Sabbath. That's what a Sabbath is a day of rest. So the day after that, the day after a Sabbath is when they bring the harvest. They bring the first of the harvest. Now, it's called a sheaf here, but it is called an omer. And it literally, they would go to the barley fields beforehand, and Nisan can't begin until there's some barley that's starting to be ripe. And they would go to the barley field, and they would select the barley. They would select a portion. The priests would pre-select that looked like it might get ripe in time. And they would mark it off so nobody messed with it. And then they would go out and they would cut a handful. Now, they selected a big enough batch that they could bring a handful for 50 days. This belonged to the temple. Nobody's touching it. You don't, if you're hungry and you walk past and you take a handful, you don't take it from this square. It's roped off.
They're set apart omers.
Is that the sheaf they're going to wave to? Or
That is the sheaf they wave. That is an omer. Okay. And they bring that section of the barley and they wave it before God, and they offer all these other sacrifices. So we've got in the week of Passover, we've got that first day, which is a Sabbath. The next follows is the Bikurim, or first fruits, and that's the day they wave it. Now, if we're going to go basically on that Sabbath being the day, that is the Sabbath, then we've got the 14th, which is the day you sacrifice. The 15th would be the Sabbath day, or a day of rest. And the 16th would be the day that early that morning they would bring the harvest.
That would count.
And that would be the
first day of the count of the Omer. So.
And actually, it would be at sunset, because remember, the day starts at sunset. That's sunset to sunset. Okay. Although that's being argued in the Messianic movement right now too. I just talked to someone whose shul is all getting ready to have a big split over this concept of does the day begin at sunrise or?
Yes.
And it's like, oh, come on, people. What are we going to fight about next?
Yes.
That's kind of what I feel like. We're going to tell them they've got it all wrong? Well, yeah, guess what? We tend to do that. Let me read the way he explains it here. The holy day is really a holy week called matzah. So this particular person writes it in this way. So the first fruits will take place the next day after the Sabbath that follows Passover. So now he's talking about the seventh day Sabbath. Okay? Since the biblical Sabbath is always the seventh day of the week, then first fruits would always fall on the first day of the week. So it would always be on a Sunday. Not all accept that. And in fact, they argued about that before Yeshua was born. They fought about it then. And what's interesting to me is this same person ends up contradicting himself later by talking about how it's counted. That the count begins 50 days beginning on the day after Passover. Okay, so which is it? Is it on the day after the Sabbath, or is it on the day after the Passover, which is a Sabbath of its own? And
it's not a Sabbath day of rest, so.
But it is.
But they're still slaughtering animals on that day.
No, they slaughtered the animals on the 14th. The 15th is the Sabbath.
Right. So which would start on the evening of after the 14th. So,
right.
So, but the
right.
Passover goes from
Pesach. The day of Pesach is
the evening of the 14th. So
the day of Pesach is the 15th, actually, because you're slaughtering on the 14th, and the sacrifices are then, but you're eating and you're resting the next day, which is the first day of the matzah, unleavened bread. Okay, so they converge. They kind of do a conversion. They kind of are like that. All right. So yeah, the Passover sacrifice is made on the 14th, but the Sabbath of Passover is the 15th.
Would be the 15th, yes.
Right. And so the next day would be the 16th. It's interesting because there are a lot of people that argue this, and they want to argue that it's actually the seventh day Sabbath that it's talking about. And so if you have the 14th and the 15th, and if we're talking about like the 14th was a Tuesday, then you'd have to wait till the Sabbath, and then it would be the Sunday. And so they don't recognize that is a Sabbath of itself. It's a high Sabbath. And this was argued at the time of Yeshua. It was argued before. Now, what's funny to me is it's the Sadducees that said it was the seventh day.
Yeah.
The Sadducees. They wanted to celebrate it always from the Sabbath. So if Passover was on a Monday, the sacrifice was done, Pesach was Monday, they did the sacrifice Monday, Tuesday would be the Sabbath unleavened bread, they'd have to wait Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, they would do their Habikarim and count from there. That's a lot of days there. It's a lot of time there, okay? The Sadducees did it that way. They wanted to do it that way. The Pharisees, however, are the ones that did it the other way. Where did I do that page? I had a whole page where I outlined that. I wrote it all out. Oh, there it is. Good. Because I couldn't get the stupid thing to print, so I couldn't just cut and paste. Okay. From Hebrew for Christians, the Sadducees, the Zadokим, the Sabbath was the Sabbath day, which made Habikarim, and therefore Pentecost or Shavuot would always be on Sunday. The Pharisees said it was the first day of Passover, so you had the sacrifice day, you had the day of rest, and the next morning. The Karaites rejected both and did their own thing with their own dates. They wouldn't even start Nisan unless the barley was ripe and the new moon was declared.
Ooh.
And guess what? We have a group doing that today.
Yeah, we have a Karaite movement going right now.
We have a huge Karaite
So
movement
like
going
a
on.
room?
Yeah, he's part of
Does something
them.
like that.
Yeah.
He's part of them. He's not
Yeah.
truly,
Lunar Sabbath.
he's not totally Karaite, but he has
that's what I
some
thought, yeah.
friends that are, and in fact, there's one of them that
Yeah.
has just come out with a thing about he's found this ancient document that supports the sacred pronunciation of the sacred name the way he thinks it should be pronounced, and he's presenting that. And
That's the second name version.
yeah, and it's being contested.
All those special groups.
Some of his stuff is good, but I don't.
But some of this
I
is
don't
just,
agree with a lot of this.
I stay away from him because the Lord told me flat out, look for the fruit. And he meant the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace. And when I watch some of these teachers, I don't see love, joy, and peace. So if I don't see love, joy, and peace, I back off. And I don't see that in them.
Yeah.
I see argumentative divisiveness, anger, agitation, and I see splitting of congregations over things like this.
Even new moon.
The
Which is
divisiveness.
the new moon. The dark
Yes.
of the sun.
Yeah, is it the new moon or the full moon that starts the month? And their argument, and here's the thing, that is a spirit of division.
Yeah.
That is not of God. Period. The spirit of division is not of God. God hates division in the body. He hates it. So, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Karaites, they all had different ideas about it. Historically, the Pharisees won out. It's the Pharisees' dates that we follow on the traditional Jewish calendar. This was supported also, by the way, by Josephus and Philo, both of the historians that wrote in the same time. Then they said this is the way it's done and the way it should be done. Yeshua followed the Pharisees' customs in everything. Now, he didn't like their excessiveness on those customs, but he never criticized the custom. He didn't say don't wear phylacteries. He said don't wear giant phylacteries.
No.
Right? We were talking about this on Sunday night. He didn't say not to wear the tzitzit. He said don't have really long tzitzit that people step on and then you can yell at them for it, I mean...
When I first became Messianic stuff, I had a dream, and it was like in the dream I was sitting there, I was standing with these big giant tzitzits like this was hanging down, and I was like going, no,
No, I don't want to do
I don't
this.
want to do that.
Well, and even in the conversation Yeshua has when they came to him and they criticized him because some of his disciples didn't wash their hands, he didn't criticize their washing their hands.
No.
He simply supported what the disciples had done based on the law of life and love. Okay? So he used Torah to argue Torah because He supported the Pharisees' positions on so many things. I don't think he would have supported the Sadducees' position. I just don't. I could be wrong.
But wasn't it a Sadducee year that he died on?
Maybe. Maybe. He died on Pesach, the day of the slaughter of the lambs. That's the day he died, Yeshua.
Oh, yeah.
He died on the day the lambs were slaughtered. That we know. The next day is the Sabbath day. That's why they wanted to get him off the cross and buried.
Which was the feast of
Because the next day is the Sabbath day, which is the festival of unleavened bread. Begins the whole week. The reason I believe that he had the Passover, the Seder, the night before, because normally a Seder would be the night you sacrifice the lambs. But it was not unusual for a disciple group, a school, to do a Seder themselves and then release the disciples to their own families to do their family Seders. That was not an unusual practice. And I really believe that was probably the practice that he used. He did the Seder with the disciples. That was kind of the teaching Seder. This is how we do it. This is what we're doing. Let's celebrate this together. Now go do this with your families, because it was supposed to be a family meal. That's my personal opinion.
Wait, I think that I can see that with, and I'm not disagreeing with it.
It's okay. You can disagree. It's all right. I don't care.
But I mean, I could see them gathering for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for the Sabbath, gathering for their family, gathering for that. But Yeshua would have done it on the evening of the 14th, which would have been the day of, as you said, the sacrifice.
But then how was he sacrificed?
Well, you sacrificed during the time when all the lambs were being sacrificed in the temple.
Right, and the lambs were sacrificed.
Because you have the evening of the 14th.
Right.
And then so you have that whole day that goes from evening till evening.
But the lamb that is sacrificed for the meal, for the Passover, is that lamb that is sacrificed on the 14th.
Right.
So, see, there's logical, there's
Yeah, because the Torah says the Passover is on the 14th, and then the first Feast of Matzah began on the 15th,
unleavened bread,
which would have been the next.
But the eating of the Passover lamb, you are eating the lamb that is sacrificed. And so to be sacrificed on this, there's all of these different things that you put together, and sometimes you're going, it almost doesn't make sense. Well, God doesn't always make sense to me. So,
some people, they just do it on the 14th and the 15th. They have the Passover.
Yeah, you can have it either day.
So.
You can have it either day, because basically you're having a Passover and you're having an unleavened bread meal. And that's what it comes down to.
Which even the Passover itself is an unleavened, because
right.
it was actually the night that they departed
right.
from.
Right, and it would have been unleavened bread because it's from the sunset to sunset. Yeah. Remember, sunset to sunset, and I'm going to stand on that one, because the very first, in Genesis it says, "And evening and morning were the first day." So based on that one verse, I'm going to stick with that, and don't even try to argue the other with me. Anyway, but still, we're still talking. We still haven't mentioned anything about the giving of Torah and why Shavuot would be a celebration of the giving of Torah. We know it's the first fruits. We know they've counted the barley harvest. They've been counting out this offering as they've been they've been bringing in the harvests. The barley harvest starts here. It's ended now. They're beginning the wheat harvest. And Shavuot is the beginning of the wheat harvest. So on Shavuot, they're going to celebrate the wheat. That's why there's 2 loaves of leavened bread. Not unleavened, leavened bread brought in. That's the only time leavened bread is brought into the temple, by the way. The only time bread with leavening is used as a sacrifice is at Shavuot. So leavened bread, that's wheat. It's a wheat product. It's leavened.
We have to wave wheat. Where do we get wheat?
Good luck.
I know. We're not in a wheat area. Where do we get some wheat?
So where do we still? Yeah, you have to grow it.
Yeah.
So where do we get the giving of Torah connected with it? Because so far all we've seen is that it's harvest, right? Mm-hmm. Exodus 19:1 and 2.
So in the 3rd new moon, after the children of Israel have come out of the land of Egypt on this day, they came to the wilderness of Sinai. For they set out for Rephidim and had come to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness. So Israel camped there before the mountain.
Okay, so in the 3rd month, on the first day of the month, they came to the mountain at Sinai. Okay, The third month happens to fall within this whole process
Yep.
of the counting.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're there for a few days, preparation, all of that stuff, before God does everything, right?
Yeah.
And so by the time they get all that stuff done, we're talking about the 6th of Sivan, which, by the way, is 50 days from the 15th of Nisan.
Oh.
So scripturally, biblically, I can say they are at the mountain at the time of Shavuot.
Yeah.
That God did give Torah at the time of Shavuot. God had not commanded them to celebrate it that way, but he still did it that way. That's scriptural support. There's also a lot of rabbinical support. The earliest known direct reference to the Feast of Shavuot being celebrated as the day Torah was given on Mount Sinai was written down in the 2nd and 3rd centuries in the Talmud, 2nd and 3rd century AD in the Talmud, tractates of Shabbat and Pesachim. But we even have a reference that predates Yeshua, the Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees, 2nd or 3rd century before Yeshua, discusses Shavuot as a celebration not just of the first fruits, but also of the giving of Torah. It's in the Book of Jubilees. At least that is what that's what Torah.org is teaching, and I wrote his name down in another place. I haven't read the Book of Jubilees, so I can't give you direct reference, but I will tell you there's more than one teacher I read this from this week. That several are now recognizing that, hey, the Book of Jubilees said it, and that was before Yeshua.
Did you read it online? I have it online.
You could read it online. I just didn't have
no,
time.
I mean, I have it all in one thing. I could send it to you. Someone send it to me. I just don't like
I don't
reading
have time.
online. Okay.
I don't have time right now, honestly, to do original sources. So that's why I appreciate those who do and document it, because then I can say, I know that's true, because they've given me the documentation. If I wanted to follow it up, I could. I don't have time for all that. But the reality is, even if we don't want to accept that it should be the celebration of that, it doesn't really matter, because the Jews of Jesus' time did. Flat out. They did. They believed that was the day that Torah was given, and they celebrated it not just as first fruits of the wheat harvest, but also as the day Torah was given. They celebrated it on that day also. So that was something they did. That's something they knew. That's something they understood. And I got to tell you, there's some really interesting things that they believed about that day that we really need to understand if we're going to understand Shavuot, if we're going to understand Pentecost.
Couldn't the first Torah be first fruits? Is that what you're saying?
So the giving of the Torah
is the first fruits.
You know what?
Is
That's
that
not a
right?
bad idea. It could be.
I mean,
It speaks of Yeshua as our first fruits, which he's the living Torah. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's the first fruit of the wheat harvest. But you're right. It could be that the Torah itself is a picture. That the first fruits is a picture of Torah. So the giving of Torah is a fulfillment of first fruits in itself. It's a great analogy. Great analogy there. Exodus 20 verses, well, let's see, if you have a Jewish Bible, it would be 15.
Exodus what?
Exodus 20. If you're reading out of a Jewish Bible, it's 15
I
through
got it,
16.
yeah.
If it's not, it's 18 through 19.
all the people experienced the thunder, the lightning, the sound of the shofar, and the mountain smoking. When the people saw it, they trembled. Standing at a distance, they said to Moshe, "You speak with us and we will listen, but don't let God speak with us or we will die." Moshe answered the people, "Don't be afraid, because God has come only to test you and make you fear him, so that you won't commit sins." So the people stood at a distance, but Moshe approached the thick darkness where God was.
Okay, all the people experienced thunder, lightning, the sound of the shofar, and the mountain smoking. In the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, there's a fascinating interpretation or an application, midrash, about this, what it means when it says all the people experienced the thunder, the lightning, the sound of the shofar. The Midrash teaches this: the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai came with flames of fire. What do you think lightning is? Right? It's flames of fire. The giving of Torah to Moses comes with flames. The giving of the Holy Spirit came the same way. We read that in Acts, right?
Yeah.
Here's what it says in the Targum. The word that went out of the mouth of the Holy One, blessed be he, was like shooting stars and lightning, and like flames and torches of fire, a torch of fire to the right and a torch of flame to the left. It flew and winged swiftly in the air of the heavens, turned around and became visible in all the camps of Israel, and by turning it became engraved on the 2 tablets of the covenant. So what this is saying is that as God was speaking the 10 commandments, the beginning of all of this, that these flames in the speech literally burned it into the 10 commandments, burned it into the stone. Whether that is accurate or not is immaterial, because to be honest, they believed it. This is what they believed. They believed, and this was that the giving of Torah came with flames, and that it was the flames of fire that were the words of God that literally burned themselves on the scroll, on the stone. The flames of fire that burned themselves. There's even a discussion about it where in the letters, the Hebrew letters, where it's a full circle of a letter, that the middle part that would be there, if we were to write it like that, there'd be a middle part, hung in mid-space. It just hung there. It stayed there. That the flame burned the whole letter out. But that here's the other thing. It burns all the way through, but it still reads the same on the front as it does on the back. Those are all miraculous ideas.
When we were like in the Lutheran or whatever way back,
Mm-hmm.
We were always taught that Moses wrote the 10 Commandments and stuff, but I had this vision of him being in some corner writing.
Right.
And that's not what happened.
And that's not what happened at all. In fact, here it tells us that that God wrote it. God put it on those tablets. And then I was taught that because he threw them down and broke them when he went back up the second time, he had to write them out. But it doesn't say that in the Torah. It tells us that God wrote it with his finger.
Yeah, but Moshe had to supply the stones for it. But the Father wrote it.
He had to supply the stones, but he didn't write them out as God dictated. God wrote them out.
Wow.
God wrote it.
Chisel it anyway.
Yeah.
I feel like the Flintstones.
So here's the sentence I want to read that I think is really, really a key thing that we have to always remember. Tom Bradford, TorahClass.org, and he wrote it this way. This was the understanding of the Jewish people in Jesus' day. It was not questioned. It was as much a part of regular Judaism then as the cross is for regular Christianity now. That's how important it is. That God's word came with flames of fire. That was essential. It still is. In most of our Bibles, we read the English words, and the people experienced the thunderings. Or some places it says, and the people witnessed the thunderings, right? Okay. The Hebrew translation, if you were to actually translate it word for word, says, the people saw the thunderings. How do you see thunder? Yeah. Thunder's a sound, right?
Vibrating air. Just
yeah. But because it says they saw the thunderings, and most translators can't figure out how you can see thunderings, they translate it, they witnessed it, or they experienced it. But it says literally that they saw the thunderings. In another ancient writing called the Mechilta, there's another midrash on how in the world they could have seen the thunder. So I'm going to read this to you right out of it. They saw what was visible and they heard what was audible. These are the words of Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Achiba said, they saw and heard that which was visible. They saw the fiery word coming out of the mouth of the Almighty as it was struck upon the tablets. As it says, the voice of the Lord hewed out the flames of fire. Psalm 29:7. But how many thunderings were there? Right? He says this was, how many thunderings were there? It's simply this. They were heard by each man according to his capacity. For it is written, the voice of the Lord was heard according to power. Psalm 29:4. Not according to his power, but according to the power of each person there, even to pregnant women according to their strength. The idea is this. Here comes the thunderings, and each one who was able to hear it, heard it, to the extent they were able to hear it. So some were able to hear all of it, they heard all of it. Some were able to hear a little bit of it, they heard a little bit of it. They heard what they were capable of hearing, because God wasn't going to overwhelm them. To each man's ability, he gave it. This is a midrash. But honestly, as I read that, it reminded me of when Yeshua was baptized. And it says the Father spoke, right? And what did he say?
My beloved Son.
This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. That is, if you heard it. If you were not capable of hearing what the Father said, what you heard was thunder. Because some there said they heard thunder. Not everyone heard it. They all heard thunder. But some in the thunder heard the voice of God. Same thing with this giving of the word. As God spoke, because he spoke the commandments. He spoke the 10 commandments out loud. And as he spoke it, each heard what part they could hear. Interesting concept. There's another midrash called Tanhuma, okay? And it said this, all the people saw the voices. How do you see voices? Flames. Okay. Note it does not say they saw the voice, but saw the voices. Wherefore Rabbi Yohanan said the voice went out and was divided into 7 voices, and from 7 voices into 70 tongues, so that all the nations could hear. And every nation heard the voice in its own tongue and was amazed. But the people of Israel heard the voice and were not heard. Do you hear what these rabbis are saying happened at the mountain? We've got flames. We've got voices. We've got tongues. Flames of fire, voices, and tongues. And that rushing, mighty sound. Right? Thundering has always been seen as God's voice since time immemorial. This is saying that the Torah was given on Mount Sinai by means of flames and thunders. Each person could perceive only what God's voice as they were able to. The single voice emitted from God, heard from Mount Sinai, became divided first into 7 voices and then into 70 languages. Why 70?
70 nations.
70 nations, because there are 70 language groups, yes. And that's exactly what it is. In the table of nations in the book of Genesis, God divided the earth into 70 nations. There are 70 nations named. Each had its own unique language. So what this is saying is that the Torah given from Mount Sinai was given in such a way that everyone on the earth had an opportunity to receive it. And this is what the disciples believed. This is what all those people that had come to Jerusalem believed. They believed that Torah was given, that there was all kinds of thunders and lightnings, this rushing sound, that this is what they believed.
Especially if it's coming from the top of the mountain, you know. Anything from a mountain echoes, you know. And hearing this vibration, you know, and feeling it.
Whether all of this was literal or not doesn't matter too much, because they believed it was.
Yeah.
Okay? And because they believed it, when they start talking about the giving of the Holy Spirit on Shavuot, they begin, and Luke describes it in much the same way. He describes it with the tongues of fire. He describes the rushing mighty wind. And he describes it, the different languages. All the languages of all the people who were there. Why does it name all of those different places that all of these people came from? There were people from every region of the Roman Empire and beyond. And all of those regions are named, pretty much. So what he's saying is, this is the Torah. This is the second coming of the Torah. Isn't that an interesting idea? The Torah has two comings. Well, the Torah does have two comings. Jeremiah 31, 30 through 32, or 31 through 33 if you have a Jewish Bible.
Here the days are coming, says Adonai, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Yehudah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day I took them by their hand and brought them out of the land of Egypt, because they, for their part, violated my covenant, even though I, for my part, was a husband to them, says Adonai. Is that the stop sign? Okay.
So here we go. I will put my Torah within them, he says. One more verse.
32, 33?
Yeah.
Okay, for this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says Adonai. I will put my Torah within them and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people.
Okay, so God tells him that I gave you Torah, but I'm going to give you Torah within you. I gave you Torah here. It was written on the stones, but the day is coming that Torah will be within you, right? A second coming of Torah. So the first coming of Torah written on stone tablets, the second coming written by flames and in hearts, and from Jerusalem, Isaiah 2:3.
Many peoples will go and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of Adonai, to the house of the God of Yaakov. He will teach us about his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion will go forth the Torah, the word of Adonai from Jerusalem.
So where is the word of God going to come out from? Jerusalem. From Mount Zion. So the first time God gives Torah on stone tablets, and it's at Mount Sinai. This time, they're showing the giving of Torah from Mount Zion, Jerusalem. So this is what they probably believed. This is what they see. This is what they saw. God works in patterns. He works in patterns. He designed patterns and he works in them. And he communicates through patterns. The Jews of his day, of Yeshua's day, had long been taught that the power of God on Mount Sinai manifested in noise, flames, and fire, and languages. This knowledge was a given, and every child grew up knowing it. So when these same signs and miracles that supposedly happen on Mount Sinai are happening here on the first Shavuot after Yeshua ascended, it says, those who have eyes to see and ears to hear will understand. Jeremiah, Isaiah's prophecies are being fulfilled at this moment. For these Jews, it's the second coming of Torah. And it's the Holy Spirit who brought the Torah this time and implanted it internally. There's too many things that are the same to think that it was an accident or it just happened or whatever. It's a fulfillment. It is a fulfillment. It's a same thing. It's what they're doing. I'm going to skip that part because it's just confusion. And I don't want to get into confusion tonight. There are some things that I was reading in this book by Stephen Gare about the tongues and about a few other things about the idea that I always thought it was the whole group up in the upper room that received the giving of the Spirit, right? Is that what you believe too?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, he believes it was just the 12 apostles. And he gives reasons for that. And the reasons make sense. But then he also goes on and talks about the giving of tongues as being an evidence of apostolic authority and that sort of thing. And I'm looking at it going, I've never heard that. I don't know about that. It makes sense, but it's immaterial, to be honest, in my book. It's not important. Whether it was just the 12 who received this or all of them, it didn't matter. One of the reasons he thinks it was just the 12 is because they're referred to as Galileans, and we know all 12 were Galileans, but not all the 120 would have been, because Mary and Martha were not from the Galilee. Okay, and they were there. It also, by the way, he says it says that it was the men. When Peter defended them, it says these men are not. Well, ours thinks these people are not, but he said it says men, and since the 120 was a mixed group of men and women, that it might have been just the 12.
It said the whole house and that all is what it says here.
Except that he says that the all he's referring to connects to the verse before that. I don't agree with him.
No.
Okay, I just don't agree with him. And part of the reason I don't agree with him has to do with the fact that he begins to limit then the use of the gift of tongues specifically as an apostolic manifestation. I can't buy that.
And
So,
since the apostolic age is over now, then that doesn't exist anymore.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's where he's headed, I think.
I had a question about the tongues. I've always been confused, and because the way they explain it here, that everybody understood, you know, in their own language, but yet Christians teach it as receiving the tongues like they did in the Acts, and you have the spiritual language, which is more of a babble.
We'll be discussing that as we go on in the book,
good.
because
I'm
there are
confused
other
about
places where the gift of tongues are given where it doesn't specify that everyone heard them in their own language. Now, in this case, it does. The Greek word that's translated tongues is languages, is glossa. Okay, so he's saying there's tongues of fire. There were languages, fire languages. It's the same thing. The word he uses when he says that he describes the fire resting on them as tongues of fire. Okay, it's the same word he uses when he talks about the languages. It's the same word. So it was a language of fire that was landing.
That's probably where we got the word glossary from.
Yep, it is, and a few other words that I can think of. But anyway, all the people saw when we go back to Mount Sinai, it says all the people saw the voices. It does not say they saw voice, but voices. And we talked about the 70. Luke is using the word tongue in the same way that it's talked about there in terms of languages. But there's another connection that I think would be really important for us to understand. And that is out of Numbers 11, 24 through 25. Did I give that to somebody?
I think so. Numbers 11, 24 through 24 and 25. Okay. Moshe went out and told the people what Adonai had said. Then he collected 70 of the leaders of the peoples and placed them all around the tent. Adonai came down in the cloud, spoke to him, took some of the spirit that was on him and put it on the 70 leaders. When the spirit came to rest on them, they prophesied, but not afterwards.
Okay, so the Spirit rests on them. This is the same Spirit that God had given Moshe. And God takes some from Moshe and he disperses it to the 70. Well, in the giving of the Spirit at Pentecost, he's taking the gift, the Spirit that was on Yeshua, and he's giving it out in the same way. Okay, it's the same concept. The word translated here, prophesy, actually means ecstatic speech. So they were speaking ecstatically. Does everything you speak ecstatically always make sense?
No.
Not always to the people that are listening to you.
Sounds like a lot of static.
So yeah, a lot of static. So that's possible. Why does it say that they all heard them in their own? I want to ask you a question. If all of these people are all speaking different languages all at the same time, is everybody going to understand them?
No.
No. Okay. So they're hearing them speak. They're hearing my language here, my language here, my language here. But it's not necessarily making sense. It's not necessarily for edification, because if everybody's talking at once, who's being edified?
You.
The person talking,
Yeah.
period.
Okay.
People listening aren't. So the gift was not about all of them expressing to these people in their own language what was going on, because then Peter had to get them all to shut up so he could talk. So he could explain what was going on, right? And when Peter spoke, it wasn't in all those languages.
So my question is also, so they didn't know this was going to happen anyway.
Right.
This is like a miracle. How did they expect to talk to all these people when they're all different languages? Did they plan to have interpreters?
Let me read
yeah.
this to you, okay? Every person in the temple crowd, including the apostles, could converse usually in Aramaic, Hebrew, or Greek.
There you go.
Okay? Those are the three primary languages.
Yeah.
The Aramaic and the Hebrew were the spoken languages of Israel itself. Hebrew was still spoken in the synagogues regularly, even outside of Israel. There was Aramaic, but they also spoke Greek. Greek was the language of business.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like for several years, it was the case that if you wanted to do international business, you needed to learn French.
So all of them knew different languages.
So they
anyway.
knew.
Yeah. Okay.
Even men from Galilee knew
Yeah.
those languages. They weren't totally uneducated hicks. They really weren't. It's just that the people in Judea, the people in Jerusalem, thought they were better number. You know, it's kind of like the people on the East Coast think they're better than people on the West Coast. But it's true.
Yeah.
You know, if you go to Princeton, well, you're better than if you go to a West Coast college. Well, that's not really true. You're not any more educated necessarily. You just think you are. So there's all of that. The languages is not about efficiency or teaching anybody. It's about the fact that when the Torah came on Mount Sinai, it came in languages and was sent out in all those languages. So it's simply a fulfillment of the giving of Torah.
Yeah. And so the question is that when the languages were going out, I mean, was everybody speaking one language, but there were 70 languages going out from the one voice coming out? Or were there some that were hearing their languages in their foreign language, but they're hearing other people over there babbling in this other language, they're hearing it over here? So as if some people would understand it, but that would be babbling to somebody else.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So what I wanted, and this whole thing, I just wanted to come back to that this isn't the first time that it happened where the Spirit's given and there's ecstatic speech. That's already there in Numbers. That the giving of the tongues wasn't necessarily just for teaching, because I've been taught that before. Yes, at that point there was understandable languages. There were people that could understand them. But if you didn't understand that language, and the whole thing would have been this cacophony of sounds. So it wasn't just so they could all reach everybody else in their own language. It really was for the fulfillment of the promise. It really was showing that Shavuot was the day of the giving of Torah by the Word of God the first time, and by the Word of God the second time, because His Spirit is His Word. The word Spirit means breath in Hebrew. Ruach is the breath. So you breathe when you speak. One of the things with Craig and this illness that he's had is it's hard for him to speak, because when you speak, you breathe out. And if you're going to project, it takes more air, right? So God's breath spoke. The flames came, and it burned the word into the tablets. God's breath breathes. And the Spirit comes and divides, just like it did from the mountain, and it lands. And the languages come. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. It's just the fulfillment. And if we have eyes to see and ears to understand, eyes to see it, ears to hear it, and we begin to understand that this is that fulfillment, we will view things differently. And as we look at the gift of tongues further on in the book, we'll talk more about what all that is, and the beyondness of, and the different types, and that can be very divisive too. And I don't expect everybody to agree with me. But I will tell you, this little Baptist girl ain't Baptist anymore on some things.
I was a Pentecostal for a while, but I never did understand that, how
Right.
it relates
and
to that.
and we
in
can
Acts. I
it
didn't
doesn't
understand
necessarily relate
Yeah.
to what happened
that.
here.
Yeah. But this is what they use, so I
Right.
didn't understand it.
Yeah, and I can explain. Well, then they didn't they didn't have the right proof texts for what they were trying to teach you, because I can teach you other things. I can show you other places. But what we do know is that this is a fulfillment. And then Peter's going to get up and explain that fulfillment, and we're not going to talk about that tonight because, frankly, we're out of time. I'm out of energy. You guys are tired. I think my battery's dead. I don't know if it's recorded the last part. The light's dim, so I think it's recorded, but I'm not sure because it's not turned off. But I realized that, I don't have it plugged in. So we'll see if this one got recorded or if I'll be back here tomorrow recording that. I have not, Saturday's message did not get recorded. And I feel really bad because it was good. I mean, it was like, and I can't replicate it because I have my notes, but a lot of that wasn't in my
I
notes
think that's why Helene was asking me about it.
because it didn't get put on the web. But hopefully this will.
I was thinking it's recorded. How come she doesn't look at it after? But I told her about, the message, and she wanted to know about, HISO and all that.
Yeah, well, we're going to have to figure something out for her to do HISO because it's kind of hard to explain. But anyway, what I wanted us to understand tonight is that Shavuot and Pentecost are the same. Mm-hmm. That what happened at the giving of Torah is the same thing that what happens at the giving of the Spirit. The Spirit is God's breath. The law is God's breath. It's His breath. It's Him. It's a representation of Him. Yeshua is the Word made flesh. Well, it's all Him. It's all Him. And it's like a glove on a hand. It fits. So these poor guys here that say they have nothing in common haven't studied it because they have way too much in common, including the whole concept of the 2 loaves. And for Shavuot, one of the books they read, one of the passages they read, is the book of Ruth. Well, Ruth was a Moabite brought in, right? She was a Gentile. She becomes one of them. What's going to happen with the Spirit later on down the road here? The Gentiles are going to be being brought in. That's going to happen. That's a prediction of that. And that does happen. And it's just a marvelous thing. And it's wonderful. And I'm so glad we get to be brought in. But we have to remember again, we're being brought into a promise to the Jewish people. We're being brought into something that belongs to God's people. And we get to join them. We don't get to replace them. And we don't get to tell them everything they've been doing wrong for 1,000 years or more. I think that's an arrogance on the part of the new Messianics. I think it's great arrogance. And I think it also shows a lack of study, a lack of understanding the wheres and the whys and looking at things like we looked at tonight where I shared with you about the book of Jubilees and all of that stuff, because I've actually heard. Hi, so here I am again finishing up the last little bit of the study from the night before. It's been a great study in the book of Acts, and I'm really thoroughly enjoying it. The point I was making at the end of the video that it cut me off in was simply this. As Gentiles, coming in, being grafted in, we need to be extremely careful. I mean extremely careful. That we not come in as arrogant, spoiled little brats who think that for some reason we have all of a sudden a new download from God to explain away all of the traditions and all of the teachings that are found in the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the other Jewish traditional writings. I think we need to be very careful, especially since most of us don't understand the concept of Midrash very well. We don't understand that the Mishnah and the Talmud give examples of argumentation among the brethren, actually. The fathers arguing between themselves and coming to conclusions that are very different from each other, and both conclusions being recorded. So we need to be careful before we judge, before we try to correct, before we assume that for some reason we now have this new meaning, this new understanding that will supersede the Jewish traditions. We need to realize that's exactly what happened with the church. The Gentile church came along. Gentiles came along and said the Jews didn't know what they were talking about. They came along and said because they rejected Yeshua, they got all the rest of this wrong too. And we built a dividing wall. Right back. In the temple, there was a dividing wall that the Jewish people put up. In Temple Complex, it was set up to keep Gentiles out of the holy place. So there's this dividing wall. There's this place where a Gentile could not come any further. If you'd not gone through the process, if you had not converted to Judaism, you were not welcome beyond that point. The reason for that was good. They firmly believed that God would strike you dead if you came in unclean. And if you were not converted, they did not know if you were going to come in unclean or not. So they didn't want to be responsible for your death. That was their reasoning. The church has built up a dividing wall of her own. We have said unless a Jewish person converts to Christianity and gives up all of the Torah traditions, all of the teachings of the fathers, including eating kosher, including the celebration of Shabbat from sunset Friday to sunset Saturday. We have come in and we have said that the way they mark the moons now is wrong because it's not by a visual sighting, forgetting the fact that the month has to be declared by a Sanhedrin, and since there's no ruling Sanhedrin, the Jewish people are doing the best they could with the setup that the last Sanhedrin set down and put in place. So we need to be aware. We need to be respectful. And I do not believe that we have the right to look at our Jewish brothers and tell them everything they've done wrong all this time. Any more than I think we have the right to go into a Christian church and stand up there and tell the pastor everything he's done wrong. And I don't want anyone coming into our congregation and standing up and telling us everything we're doing wrong. We need to have respect one for another. And without that respect, without that listening, we can't even begin to have healthy debates, healthy discussions where we understand each other and listen to each other's reasons. Until and unless we have sat down and fully heard out the reasons that the Jewish people have established these things, we have no business reestablishing or changing or coming in with our own traditions, our own doctrines, our own dates, our own teachings that are so separated from what has been taught. I think we need to look to those who've been able to do the research, who've dug in deep. And I fully respect places like First Fruits of Zion. I respect the organization TorahClass.org with the teachers that are there. Although there are some of those teachers that I have read some of their stuff and I've gone, this is still very dispensational. And as you may have guessed by now, I've kind of rejected the whole concept of dispensationalism. But that doesn't mean that I reject people who are in dispensational beliefs. I just think it clouds our thinking in some ways of the scriptures. Judaism is not dispensational. There was no age of the patriarchs, age of the fathers, change to the age of the law, change to the age of the church. Come on. Yes, there are eras of teaching. Yes, there are times that can be delineated of how God has worked in the different time frames. But God is still God. He is still the same. So before we reject out of hand or before we listen to someone who comes in with an anger and a vengeful spirit and an attempt to say that they know more than, they are better than. We need to come back and look at the concept of humility, the concept that God said we are to function under love. When I began looking at the Messianic movement, when I began having my paradigm shift, I was very blessed to hear a teaching at a Love for Israel conference in the Portland area. John Conrad did a teaching, and I admire John Conrad, and maybe someday I'll get to tell him that, because he's a respectful man. He's a learned man. He's done much study. He doesn't come into it with anger or agitation or to prove a point of any kind. He has called out some people within the Messianic movement that he has been a part of for a very long time, and he has tried to correct some of these things with a patience and a gentleness that I'm not seeing all the way around, that I wish I could see all the way around. But John Conrad came in and he said, Messianic churches grow up here, they come up here, they pop up, they die off. It pops up, dies off, pops up, dies off, pops up, dies off. There's no longevity in congregations. It's like we grow up and then we split. And so there's no established congregation. And he said, he asked the Lord about that, and the Lord showed him this. In the 10 Commandments it says, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land the Lord gives you. He said, as a movement, we tend to not do that. We tend to dishonor. We look at Judaism, the fathers of the faith, and we say to them, you got everything wrong, and we get mad and we get upset and we act in rebellion. Then we look at Christianity, the place where we were mostly birthed in the Spirit, birthed in the new birth in Yeshua. Most of us have come from there. And we look at her and we criticize and we disrespect and we tell them everything they're doing wrong, and we act in rebellion and anger. If we act in rebellion and anger, we are violating the commandment of God. We are to respect, honor, revere, give place of honor to them, both Judaism and the church. Does that mean we're going to agree with everything? No. But where we disagree, we need to do so gently, with love, with compassion. And we need to be able to sit down and in patience and gentleness answer the questions as to why we disagree. If we can't do that, then we have no place changing anything. That's my story, and I'm going to stick with it. That's what we stand for here at Sabbath Streams. You are welcome to join us whether you agree with me or not on any of these things. You are welcome to come and fellowship with us. I'm just not going to allow conversations that become bitter and angry to continue. They don't happen in this congregation. I won't allow them to happen. If you want to come in and sit down and discuss reasonably why you believe certain things, and listen to me explain why I believe certain things, and we can do this in an agreeable manner, you're welcome to come and do that. But don't do it behind our backs. That's Lashon Hara. Don't do it in a mean-spirited way. Do it with peace and gentleness of spirit. And then we can respond with peace and gentleness of spirit. And that's the way it needs to be. Until Messiah comes and corrects it all, we're all going to only see partly. We see in part. When we see Yeshua, we will understand it all. Until then, let's operate and walk in love. The next teaching in the book of Acts is we're going to go over the message that Peter gives on the day of Pentecost, where he explains the connection between the day of the Lord and the coming of the Holy Spirit. And that connection is going to be an interesting one to study. Until then, be blessed. Next week, we're going to be doing Tu B'Shavat. We're going to be talking about that holiday and what it means and how that applies to us. And it's going to be an interesting study next Wednesday. And the Wednesday after, we will go on with Peter. Thank you so much. God bless. We will see you around. Let us know if these tapes or these recordings are ministering to you. If they are, please let us know. And if you can help support this ministry, that's greatly appreciated. And that's about all I'm ever going to say about money on these videos. Thank you. Bye-bye.